Hello there, M3. This is our third lesson about genetics. For this video, we are going to talk about Mendelian genetics. So please get your Mastering Science book and open to page 52. So before we start, let me ask you first a question. So why do you think a child look like their parents or grandparents? Before the discovery of chromosome, which was in 1880, so many believe that the appearance of a child depends on the mixture or the combination of the traits from parents or from the grandparents. So it was until like 1856 when an Austrian monk named Gregor Mendel put his interest in learning or studying about inheritance of traits. So inheritance of traits is like it is a characteristic that you get from your parents or from your grandparents from one generation to another generation. So by which in this case, so Gregor Mendel, who has also had an interest in astronomy and plant breeding, so Gregor Mendel focuses more about studying or using pea plants in studying about genetics. And you might be wondering why pea plants, of all the plants that you have there in botany world, why did Gregor Mendel choose pea plants? So number one, they are inexpensive, meaning they are cheap to buy. Number two, reproduction is easy to control. It's easy because you can do like cross-pollination, or you can just do self-pollination. So Gregor Mendel used these two types of pollination, which is your cross-pollination and self-pollination, and do the fertilization during in his experiment. Number three, produce many offspring. So offspring means like your children. Okay. So if you look at the picture on the right, so you can see there are lots of seeds, okay, that a pea plant can produce. And then number four, they are complete flowers. So a complete flower has four basic parts, and these are your petal, your pistil, your stamen, and then your sepal. So these are the four parts of a complete flower or a perfect flower or a bisexual flower. So pistil, this is the female part, of a flower, and then your stamen, this is the male part of your flower. So your pistil has three basic parts. This one is your stigma. This one is your style. And this one is this picture here. This is your ovary. And your stamen, this one is your anther. It contains pollen. So it has pollen in it, which was used by Mendel to study inheritance of pea plants. And then this is your filament here. So again, so your perfect flower has four basic parts. You have your petal, your pistil, your stamen, and then your sepal. Okay, going back. So your pea plants have this contrasting characteristics. Contrasting, it means the opposite traits or opposite characteristics. Example, like tall and short, white and black. What else? Beautiful, ugly. Those are like example of your contrasting characteristics. But for pea plants, So you can look at this one in your book. So Gregor Mendel studied about the seeds, the flowers, the pods, and the stems of your pea plants. By which for the seeds, so Mendel focuses on the shape and color. So for shape, you have round and wrinkled. So this is what I mean by contrasting characteristic, like round versus wrinkled. For color, you have yellow and green. For the flower, so Gregor Mendel focuses on color. So that is your purple and white. And for the pod, that is where your seeds are placed. So you have your shape, such as inflated versus constricted. For colors, we have yellow and green. And for the stem, for the flower position, it can be eggshell meaning along the stem. And then terminal meaning here on top of the pea plant here. And also with your plant height, that is tall versus short. How did Mendel start his experiment? So basically, there were like 7 characteristics that were studied by Mendel. So he did it one at a time so that he can record it and produce some evidence about the inheritance of traits. So for this part, so we will just be focusing on one trait, and that is about the color of the flower. So for number one, so Mendel did like cross-pollination of the pure plants with contrasting traits. So let's begin first with this word cross-pollination or cross-pollinating. So in cross-pollination, you have 2 flowers. Let's say this is flower A and flower B. We're in the stamen, or shall we say the pollen. Do you still remember the word pollen? Okay, the pollen from your stamen of your flower A is transferred to the pistil. Do you still remember this part? This is your stigma. So your stigma receives the pollen from flower A, or it can be the pollen from your flower B is transferred to the stigma of your flower A. So in cross-pollination, so you need 2 flowers to do this one, 2 or 3 more flowers. However, for Mendel, so what he did was, so he uses the pure plants to cross-pollinate. So pure plants, pure means 100%. Okay. The other word was like hybrid. The other word was hybrid. Hybrid is like a mixture, something like 70-30%, like 50% and 50% of this one that is hybrid. But for the beginning of experiment of Mendel, he started with the pure plants with contrasting traits. So this is what he did. So Mendel choose a pure purple flower plant and transfer the pollen from the purple plant to the stigma of your white flower. And then, so to make sure that the pollen from the white flower will not get inside through its own stigma, so Mendel removed them. So what is left here in the white flower is its own pistil. And then, so over a course of like 2 weeks or 3 weeks, so your pea plants develop its own pod. This is your pod with its own seeds. And then after that one, Mendel planted them, and the result was all offspring. Offspring is what I told you, the baby or the children. So the children or the babies of this purple and white flower. So it has been observed that all of them had a purple flower result. Okay. So in this case, we call them like the filial or the first filial generation or the F1 offspring. Okay, so the F1 offspring, all of them had purple flowers. Okay, so Mendel did not stop there from the F1 generation. So Mendel continued to experiment in the first filial generation. So we're in, so Mendel again, using the process of your self-pollination, using the process of self-pollination or self-fertilization. So for this case, the purple flower, since all F1 offsprings are purple, so the pollen from its own flower is transferred to the, or was transferred to its own stigma here. And then after again 2 to 3 weeks, so this flower developed pod, and then the seeds were planted. And the result was astonishing because in the second filial generation, or the F2 offsprings, so these are the children of the F1 generation. So it was observed that there were like 705 purple flowers and 224 white flowers, wherein for every 3 purple flowers, there will be like 1 white flower. So I just divided like 705 divided by 224, and you will get this ratio, which is 3/1. Okay. So what does it mean? It was that in the first generation or the F1 generation, so there are some traits that were hidden or were not shown in the first generation, but those hidden traits or those traits were observed in the second generation. Okay, so as a summary, so this P, this is your parental generation. So in your parental generation, so this flower is 100% purple flower, and this one is also 100% white flower. So doing the cross pollination and cross fertilization, so as a result was that 100% purple flowers. So doing the self-pollination, meaning they use the same purple flower of your F1. So it yields 3:1 ratio, wherein there's like 75% purple flower and there is like 25% white flower. Okay. So as what I've told you, so Mendel did not stop only with one trait. So he continued for like 7 years in studying the characteristics of these pea plants. So in your page 55, so you have there the different results of Mendel's study of inheritance. So in your parental generation, so just the same with your flower. So Mendel continued to cross-pollinate and studied the different traits. So like for example, he combined the pea plant that has round seed and the pea plant with wrinkled seed, yellow seed versus green seed, purple and white flower, inflated versus constricted, yellow pod versus green pod, and so on and so forth. So going back in your seeds, so it was revealed that in your F1 generation, so it was revealed that in round seed versus wrinkled seed, all seeds were round. For yellow and green seed, all seeds were also yellow color, inflated versus constricted. So it appeared that all of them are inflated. So the results were consistent. So we're in your F1 generation. So it's like mostly 100% However, in your second generation, so it yielded two results. So, like for example, for the for the round versus wrinkled seed, so it has observed that round seed there were like 5,474, and then for the wrinkled bearing seeds, so you have like 1,850, and for the yellow color, so there were like 6,022 yellow seeds, and for the green seeds, there were like 2,001 seeds. So by which basically, so in your F1 generation, so not all traits were expressed, or not all traits were exposed or revealed in your F1 generation, but those traits were carried into the next generation. So you might be thinking that since the seeds were all around here, so you are expecting that until F2, F3, F4, they will all be around. No, the characteristics of your wrinkled seed, the characteristics of your wrinkled seed, they have been like carried in your F1 generation, and it might show in the future generations, by which in this case, so the characteristic of your wrinkled seed were revealed in your F2 generation. Okay? And speaking of this, and speaking of the results, so you might be observed that so traits were classified into two. So you have your dominant trait versus the recessive trait, wherein a dominant trait means a strong trait. So meaning if you have like, if you're going to combine weak and strong, so the strong will appear, the strong will dominate, the strong will lead. So that is your dominant trait. And for recessive trait, that is a weak trait. So in your F1 generation here, so we can say that your round characteristic, so this one is your dominant trait, this one is your dominant trait, and this one is your recessive trait. All yellow here, yellow is your dominant, and your green seed is your recessive. Purple here, this one is your dominant, and this one is your recessive. Inflated, so this one is dominant, and this one is recessive. And then green, so this one is dominant, and this one is recessive. All flowers along the stem, so this one is dominant, and this one is recessive. All long, so this one is dominant and this one is recessive. Okay, so this dominant trait and recessive trait is not only for plants but also for humans. So I have here a short list of different dominant and recessive traits. So let's have our first example, like tongue rolling. Remember that in your chromosome lesson, so one trait can be from the mother and another trait is from the father, by which if you combine those two, only one trait will appear in your offspring or into your children. So for this case, so for the tongue rolling, if you can roll your tongue like this, so if it is a yes, so it's a dominant trait. And if you cannot roll your tongue like this, so that is a recessive trait. So for your dominant trait, so it can be, there are three possibilities. So like for example, this is your father and this is your mother. Okay. So if your father can roll his tongue and you get its characteristic from him, and at the same time, you get the characteristic of the mother that has also or that can roll her tongue, then there's a 100% chance that you can also roll your tongue. Or it can be that you get the trait from father that can roll his tongue. However, the mother shared a trait that you cannot roll a tongue. So still, so this one has a dominant trait, or your father has this dominant trait, so there's a chance that you can also get, or you can roll your tongue. Or it can be that you get a trait from your father that cannot roll his tongue, but you get the characteristic from the mother, from your mother, that she can roll her tongue. So there's also a chance that you can roll your tongue. However, in your recessive case, if the father cannot roll his tongue and then the mother cannot also roll his tongue, so there's a chance that you cannot roll your tongue as well. Okay? So I'll be giving you this one as your homework. So your notebook. So I want you to skip the first page and start on the second page and copy and answer the homework. So for your homework, so it's simple. So this symbol here, these are your recessive traits. And without this one, that is your dominant trait. So like for example, you got a trait from the mother who has a normal eyesight, and you got a trait that is nearsighted from the father. So what do you think is the offspring? So the offspring is nearsighted. Why nearsighted? Because nearsighted here is a dominant trait. So as long as you have a dominant trait, so it is expected that the offspring will have a dominant trait. So by which in this case, so nearsighted is a dominant case. Okay, so I'll be giving you like 1 to 6 as your homework. So please look at the symbols again. So this asterisk here, so they are your recessive traits. Without uh, without asterisk, just like this one, these are your dominant traits. Okay. So that ends the lesson for this video, and thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something M3. Okay. See you in the next video. Bye bye.